Well, good evening, everyone. I trust you can hear me okay. I'd like to welcome you to the Unit 3. Tonight we're going to talk about supply and demand. Before we get into supply and demand, though, let's quickly review what we covered last week in Unit 2. And what we see is we talked a little bit about Tom on the island as a castaway, and we were looking at his production possibility frontier curve. And we found that he could produce down in the yellow area. However, he needs all of the production that he can get in order to have enough food to survive, enough coconuts and enough fish. So, although it'd be possible for him to produce down in that area, it would not be efficient. Okay? And we also saw that it's impossible, not possible at all, for him to produce out beyond the production possibility frontier curve because he's using all of his available resources just to get to the curve itself. Any spot on that curve is using all of his resources. So if we want him to be able to produce more than that, we have to give him more resources or give him better technology to use those resources smarter. And we also saw that this particular model is a surrogate, if you will, for the whole economy, where that outer curve would represent the total output of our economy. And if we want to improve everyone's standard of living, we need to expand that output. Okay? And so how do we do it? We can't add more resources. We need to be able to use the resources we have smarter. And again, I was assuming that our main resources are people. Okay, our laborers. So, the other thing we saw was if we measure individual batches of fish, and here we're saying that there's 20 fish in a batch, we found that Tom could get his first batch and only had to give up 5 coconuts. His marginal opportunity cost in coconuts of that first batch of 20 fish in the green in this slide would only be 5 coconuts. But we saw as he wants more and more and more fish, that his marginal opportunity cost of the next batch of fish is quite a bit higher. It jumps to 25 coconuts. And we saw some reasons for that. But what we were demonstrating was that as we produce more and more and more of something, we reach a point where we have increasing marginal opportunity costs. The reason for that is that when we start producing something, we use the very best resources to produce that thing in the beginning. Okay? And then as we want more and more and more of that item, we have to use resources that are less well suited for making that item. Okay? And so therefore our individual cost, or our marginal opportunity cost of the next batch of that item, is going to be higher than the previous batch, and therefore we have increasing marginal opportunity cost. We also saw that in doing the production possibility frontier model, that causes us to have a curve that is bowed outward and to the right. Okay, as we see here. So increasing marginal opportunity cost is what causes that curve to be bowed outward and to the right. Okay, we saw that, again, as I was saying earlier, if we want to increase the total output of the economy, then we have to either provide more resources or we have to use the resources we have already more productively. In other words, work smarter, use new technology, use whatever it takes. And again, that's even though we're talking in a very simple model here, that same dictum applies to the entire country when we look at the overall economy of our country. Okay, with that said, let's see if that helps any. With that said, I don't know if that's going to help any. We saw how we went to an even simpler model. This simpler model was where the marginal opportunity costs are the same. They don't increase. That gave us the straight lines for Tom and for a newbie on the island for Hank. And then we made some computations based on the maximum number of fish each one could produce and the maximum number of coconuts they can produce, and we computed a marginal opportunity cost of fish and coconuts for each player in this particular model. And what we found was that although Tom is best at everything, that means he has an absolute advantage. He could do way more than Hank in either coconuts or fish. Okay. However, when we look at his marginal opportunity cost of getting fish, we find that his marginal opportunity cost is a lot lower. He only has to give up 3/4 of a coconut for each fish, where if Hank goes fishing, he has to give up 2 coconuts to get 1 fish because he's not as good at doing that. Okay? Then we look at what happens in terms of coconuts, the lower line here in the chart that you see, and we find that in this case, Tom has to give up 1 1/3 fish to get a coconut because he's much better at getting fish. Okay? And but Hank only has to give up 1/2 of a fish to get a coconut. So we find that Hank, although he's not near as good as Tom is at doing either thing, he does have a lower marginal opportunity cost of getting coconuts. So therefore he has a comparative advantage in getting coconuts, and he should specialize in that. While Tom, who has absolute advantage in everything, has a comparative advantage to Hank in getting fish, and therefore he should specialize in getting the fish. Now the crux of this issue is that absolute advantage has nothing to do with trade. It only says who can produce the most of whatever we're talking about. So we cannot tell when we look at who is trading what products whether or not they have an absolute advantage in those products. The only thing we can tell is that the thing they are trading the most of is the thing they have a comparative advantage in. Okay. Moving on, we looked at what a positive and normative statement was. And again, the key to that is a positive statement is not, and again, we're not interested in what's good or bad. We're not interested in any moral judgments on the statement. We're not interested if it makes sense. All we're interested in is it is a positive statement if it comes from exact numbers that can be measured. Then it's a positive statement. And we normally associate those with statements that start off with something is or something was. Okay? And we can go measure those numbers. On the other hand, a normative statement, again, is not good or bad. All it is somebody's opinion of what they think should be done. So it is a should statement. Okay? With that, if you do have any questions, make sure you let me know. You can, either by email or by phone or whatever. Okay? Moving on tonight, we're going to move into the real nitty-gritty, if you will, of economics. We're going to talk about supply and demand. Now, you'll notice that in the announcements and in the course itself, there are links to several videos that were done to explain supply and demand. I am likely not going to have enough time in this one seminar to thoroughly explain supply and demand, so make sure you go through those videos. They will help you immensely. Okay, well, remember we need some basic assumptions for our perfectly competitive or free market. And again, we're going to use the example here of the farmer's market, where we have many producers of tomatoes. And the first thing is that in this perfectly competitive market or free market, we assume that all the buyers and all the sellers are dealing with the exact same product, some commodity. In this case, tomatoes would be the example. Okay? We also assume that no one seller sells so much that they can control the price. And you see our example over there on the right is Microsoft. They are the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to computer operating systems. They have something on the order of 82% of the market, something like that. And Apple has another 16% of the market, and the rest is spread between just a few other producers, Linux, Unix, what have you. Okay, so in a free market or a perfectly competitive market, no one seller sells so much that they can control the price. Likewise, in a perfectly competitive market, no one buyer buys so much that they can control the price. What are we talking about there? Imagine that you're a producer of, you've invented some item and you've talked Walmart into taking it on and selling it in their store. Well, now Walmart can come to you and say, we're buying 90% of what you produce. We want you to lower the price to us. And you say, well, I've got my cost as low as I can go. I can't go any lower. And they come back to you and they say, well, you need to lower your price even more. Why don't you move your plant to China, where you can get much lower labor, and we'll buy all you produce. Okay? So here's a case where they are forcing a company to do something to lower their price to that one particular buyer. Okay? In a perfectly competitive market, we have no buyers that buy so much that they can control the price. And then our final assumption, it may be a little unrealistic for real life, but it is the basic assumption for a perfectly competitive market, and that is that all the buyers and all the sellers know what everybody else is doing. So they know what the equilibrium price is. Okay? They know when that equilibrium price changes. We call that perfect knowledge. Okay? So those are the underlying assumptions in a perfectly competitive market model, which is what we're going to study in the rest of this seminar. Okay? And with that, what is a marketplace? Well, remember, we talked a little bit about a marketplace before. That's where buyers and sellers come together to exchange the same product, and they end up settling on a price. Now, they're going to settle on what we call an equilibrium price, where all the product that the seller wants to sell at that price, there will be a willing buyer who wants to buy it at that price. And all the consumers who want to buy that product at that price will find a willing seller who wants to sell to them at that price. Okay? So that price is what we call the equilibrium price, and the amount that the buyers and sellers agree to exchange at that price is the equilibrium quantity. Those are the two numbers we're concerned with. And what we find is, in a perfectly competitive market, once that equilibrium price is set, that there will be no surplus of product. What that means is there's no extra product that sellers want to sell at that price that they cannot find a willing buyer to buy. And on the flip side, there are no buyers who want to buy product at that price who cannot find a willing seller to sell to them. So there is no buyers who want to buy and can't find any. So there's no shortage. So by definition, a perfectly competitive market is the most efficient market when it reaches equilibrium, because there will be no surplus of product and no shortage of product. Okay, so let's use a simple example. Let's say that gasoline was $3.50, which it was not too long ago. Okay, at $3.50 a gallon, you're probably like me. You do a certain amount of driving at that price. Maybe you'd be willing to buy 25 gallons a week, depending on your vehicle. Okay, now, if the price were to go down, and here I've used an extreme example. I'm talking about it going down all the way to $1 a gallon. We know it's going down a little bit right now, but it's nowhere near $1 a gallon. But if it were as cheap as $1 a gallon, you'd probably be willing to buy a lot more gasoline. And if you knew it was going to stay at $1 a gallon, you might even be willing to go out and buy a bigger, fancier car with a bigger engine in it. And so in this example, would say you'd be willing to buy 40 gallons in a week. Okay? Now, If we went back to the dark ages, back when I got my driver's license, and we were buying gas for 35 cents a gallon, well, nobody even thought about buying a, supercharged Chevy, with a super big engine. Matter of fact, I think my Chevy had a 348 cubic inch engine with two 4-barrel carburetors, right? So we didn't even worry about gasoline at 35 cents a gallon. We'd buy a ton of it. What about on the flip side? If gas were to go from the current around $3, say up to $6 a gallon, oh, now we've got to be a little bit more judicious in how we use our gasoline, right? You can't just go out willy-nilly just driving for the sheer fun of it. We're not going to take and pile the family in the car and go out sightseeing on Sunday afternoon just for the fun of it when we're paying $6 a gallon for gas. We're probably just going to get enough gas to go to work and do the shopping and the minimum things we have to do. What happens if, heaven forbid, gas were to go up to $10 a gallon? Well, now we're going to do absolutely everything we can to avoid buying gasoline. Now, there may be some certain minimum amount we need just in case we have to take the kids to the hospital or something like that. But we're definitely not going to buy nearly as much gasoline. So what we call this set of numbers is, you notice we have a quantity at each price that we're willing to buy. So we would call this a demand schedule because it tells how much we would demand at each price. Okay? So we can just put those numbers down. We don't need all the words. And now we have our demand schedule. Okay? Now, what we want to do, now if we were talking about the entire country, we just add a whole bunch of zeros in the back of those numbers, right? Again, instead of talking 5 gallons a week, we might be talking about 5 million gallons a week, or whatever the number is, okay? So, with that, I'm not going to worry about the number of zeros on the end. I'm just going to use the number, but we understand what we're looking at, right? So we have a demand schedule. We know at $10, we're only going to buy a few, in this case 5. At 35 cents, we'd buy a lot, we'd buy 75. Okay, now how do we go about constructing a demand curve? Well, very similar. I'm going to use a different set of numbers, but these numbers are similar in a way. Here we've got $9, we buy 1, $7, we buy 3, $5, 5, $3, 7, and $1 we buy 9. So it's not the exact same numbers we just talked about in gasoline, but it's the same concept. Mainly because I already had these numbers created and the graphs to go with them, and they mirror the graphs and the numbers that are in the videos that I told you about. Okay, so how do we plot this demand curve? Well, we need dollars on the vertical axis, the axis going up. We start off with very low numbers at the bottom, and as we go up, we have higher and higher numbers. Across the bottom on the horizontal axis, we put the quantity. And we start off with very few on the left, and as we go to the right, we get more and more and more. Okay? So all we have to do is plot each one of these points. So at $9, we have 1 that's purchased, and at $7, we have 3 purchased. So we just plot the points. Okay? And we plot the rest of the points. Now, what we want to do then is connect those points with a curve. So we draw a line connecting the points. And you say, wait a minute, Sam, that doesn't look like a curve. No, it's not a curve. I'm using a very simple model here where the curve is a straight line. But were we to be actually doing this for real, this would be a curve. Okay. Now, we need to label it. So on either end, you'll notice I put D1 on either end of the blue curve, or blue line. That stands for the demand curve. The D means demand, and the 1 means the first curve we're talking about. Now, we can clean up that graph by getting rid of the lines and the dots, and now we just have the curve. Okay. Now, there's a couple things that can happen. We can have changes that cause us to do something different with this demand curve. The first case, we know what happens when price changes. Okay. Obviously, when we looked at price changing, let me check one thing real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we know that there's a certain amount at a certain price, and if we were to lower the price, like we saw with the gasoline, people are going to buy more. They're going to demand more. If the price goes higher, they're going to demand less. And we call that movement along the curve. What controls that is the change in price. Now, if you're looking at a supply and demand problem and they ask you something about the demand and they tell you there's been a change in price, then you know that you're going to keep the existing curve, but you're going to have some movement up or down it. Now, I will tell you, most of our problems are not going to be that way. Okay? That just shows what the changes are. Okay, higher or lower. There's a second situation that can happen where we can create a new demand curve, and if more is going to be demanded at every price, that new demand curve would be shifted to the right from the original demand curve. Remember, more equals movement or shift to the right. Okay, what would be an example? Well, any one of these 5 reasons could cause that to happen. First reason would be if there were suddenly more consumers. So for example, assume that you were selling this particular product was being sold in America, period. Now, suddenly we have we already have a certain demand from people in America. Now, if you were suddenly able to also sell that product, say, in Germany or in Europe, now you're going to have a lot more consumers, and therefore more is going to be demanded at every price. We're going to have a new demand curve shifted to the right from the original. Okay? Now, so we see the first reason would be more consumers. A second reason for having a demand curve shifted to the right would be if all the existing consumers suddenly had a lot more money. Well, what is one way that the government could immediately give all consumers much more money? Well, more money. I don't know, much more. Okay. Well, think of what you have to do on April 15th each year. You've got to pay your taxes. Well, if the government were to lower the tax rate so that you did not have to pay as much to the government in taxes, then you would have that extra money to spend on stuff, and everybody in the country would have that little bit of extra money to spend on stuff. So now everybody in the country is going to be demanding a little bit more of something, we don't know what, and that's going to cause the demand curve to shift to the right. Another example would be item 3 in the yellow block. What about if there's more taste for the item? And what would be an example of that? Well, let's say that tomorrow morning you get up and the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta publishes in all the newspapers and all the television reports that if people would start drinking 1 extra cup of coffee a day, that they would have less chance of having cancer. Well, if that were to happen, all of a sudden a lot of people who are already drinking coffee would drink a little bit more, and people who are not drinking coffee would probably start drinking coffee. Okay? So therefore, if you were measuring the demand for coffee, you would find that there was more demand for coffee at every price, giving us a new demand curve shifted to the right. Another example, item 4, would be a change in expectations. Well, let's think back a little bit. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we've been recovering from a pretty hefty recession. A lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of people had pretty hard times. Okay? And even people who were still working got very cautious, and they stopped spending as much money. Okay? They didn't buy as many non-essential things. Well, here we are 7 years later. The most important latest news report was that our unemployment rate had actually dropped below 6%. Well, that's a pretty amazing number. I mean, we've been as high as 10% in the last 7 years, and now we're down to below 6. So people are starting to feel pretty good about the future. Okay? Their job seems relatively secure. Maybe they've even gotten a raise lately. So they're feeling better about the future. So now they have what we call a change in expectations. They're expecting the future to be more rosy and better. So they're more willing to go out and buy things, as non-essential things, more like luxuries, than they were before. Maybe it's time to replace that refrigerator that's been squeaking so bad that you're afraid it's going to quit working any day, but it's been working. Right? But now you feel a little bit better, so you feel it's safe to go ahead and go out and buy that. Okay. So everybody doing the same thing is going to cause our demand curve again to shift to the right, because more would be demanded at every price. And then the last example here of a reason would be if there was an increase in the price of a substitute product. Substitute product, let's say you're looking at coffee and tea. Okay? You go to Starbucks, you might buy a cup of coffee, you might buy a cup of tea. They both cost the same amount, let's say $4, and I'm just making this up. So, therefore, on one day you might go in and buy a cup of coffee. The next day, you might go in and buy a cup of chai tea. Well, suddenly the price of chai tea goes up dramatically, say maybe from $4 to $10 a cup. But the price of coffee stayed the same. From then on, you probably buy more coffee than you would tea. So there, the increase in the price of the substitute product caused you to buy more of the original product. And therefore, the demand curve for the original product shifted to the right. Now, we can have the opposite of those 5 things happen, and then less would be demanded at every price, and our new demand curve would be shifted to the left. Okay, now I should tell you that any problems you encounter in this course that deal with supply and demand is going to deal, if it relates to demand, it's going to deal with one of these 5 situations. Okay? It may be more customers, it may be fewer, it's whatever the situation is in the problem. Okay, that said, what about the supply side? Well, suppliers are a little different than buyers. Let's assume now that you're the tomato salesperson. Okay, you had this small organic farm, you're growing tomatoes, and you sell them at the local farmer's market. Now, if the price were $10 a pound for tomatoes, man, you would do everything you could to get as many tomatoes together so you could sell as many as you could, because you could really make some serious profit at that. You'd sell 75 pounds a week. If the price was a little bit lower, say $5, you might only want to sell 30 pounds. If the price got down to $3.15, you probably wouldn't want to sell very many. You'd sell what you had, but you wouldn't go crazy to get a lot more, because the price is getting so low. By the time the price fell to $1.75, by then, you're just going to sell the extras you have laying around, and that's about it. By the time the price drops to 75 cents, you're going to say, the heck with it. It's not even worth my gas to go there. And so therefore, you're not going to sell any. Okay? So you see how, as a supplier, your rationale is different than as a buyer. Okay? But it still relates to your own good. So those numbers become your supply schedule. Okay? And again, I'm going to use some similar numbers. They're not exactly the same, but these relate to the numbers that are in the video. Again, when the price is high, the supplier wants to supply a lot. When the price is low, they want to supply very few. That gives us a different shaped curve. So here, if we hear something that either causes a change in price, or the problem tells us about a change in price, and we know that the price has gone down, then we're going to know that we're going to have movement along the existing supply curve to a lower point where less is going to be supplied. On the flip side of that, if we were to be told or see that the price increases, then we know our suppliers are going to supply a lot more at that new higher price. Okay? And again, we can have a situation where the problem tells us something that causes a shift in the supply curve. And again, if there's more going to be supplied at every price, the shift will be to the right. So we'll look at an example of that. There are 5 reasons, again, why we would have more supplied at every price. The first reason would be if there were more suppliers in the business. If we suddenly have a lot more producers making the product, growing the tomatoes or whatever it is, then ultimately that's going to drive the price down. That means more is going to be supplied at every price. Okay? So more suppliers means a shift to the right of the supply curve. If the cost of the ingredients or raw materials to make whatever it is go down, then suddenly we're going to be able to produce more at every price likewise. Imagine that you're producing or selling something that requires a lot of petroleum, a lot of gasoline, and the price of oil goes up, up, up. Well, that's your cost of your input. And so, but if that input price goes down like it is right now, we've had oil drop from basically $110 a barrel down to about $85 a barrel over several weeks. So here the price of an input is going down. That means suppliers who make things using that oil can produce more at every price. We'd have a new supply curve shifted to the right. Now, if we were suddenly to improve the technology that our producers were using, now they would be much more efficient and they would have lower cost of production, and so therefore they could produce more at every price, and we would have that shift again to the right. Now, item 4 says a change in expectations. Well, suppliers have an idea of what the future is going to look like too. And if they see the unemployment rate getting better and better, they see more and more people going to work, they see some people getting raises. And they know that the more this happens, the more people are going to want to buy. Right? So therefore, they'll start gearing up production because they expect things to be better in the future. And therefore, we'll have more supplied at every price, and we'll have a shift to the right of the supply curve. And then finally, if a related product that people could buy either one or the other, and the price of that related product goes down, then the demand, in other words, this is a related product is something you make from the same raw materials. Okay? And so use the example of gasoline and heating oil. We have a barrel of oil can be refined by the refiners. It can be refined either into heating oil or into gasoline. Well, during the summertime, when it's really warm out, fewer and fewer people want heating oil, and therefore the price goes down. Well, if the price goes down for heating oil, the producers, the refiners, are going to make more gasoline because they can make more profit off the gasoline. And therefore, they're going to increase the supply of gasoline at every price because the price of the heating oil went down. So again, we have those 5 reasons. Now, the opposite of those 5 reasons would cause the exact opposite to happen. It would cause less to be supplied at every price. Okay? And we would have a new supply curve that was shifted to the left from the original. Now notice item number 3 is lined out. We are not suddenly going to adopt a new technology that is worse than the original technology. We're only going to adopt a new technology that improves output and reduces our cost of production. So therefore, that reason doesn't really count on shifting to the left. I think that makes sense to everybody. Okay. So what we need to do ultimately is combine that idea of the supply curve with the demand curve and see what happens. Well, if we take those 2 curves, assuming they are for the same commodity, in this case I'm saying it was coffee beans, and we have the supply schedule in the blue chart on the right side of the picture in the middle column, And on the far right column, we have how much is demanded at each of those prices. And we see there is one price where the amount that suppliers are willing to supply is exactly equal to the amount that consumers are willing to demand. And when we plot the two curves on the graph, we see they cross at that point, at that price of $5. And if we drop a line straight down to the quantity, we see it's 6, just as it says on the supply and demand schedules. In other words, the chart of numbers. So that's how we got the graph the way it looks. That is our equilibrium price. So everybody who wanted to buy a certain quantity at $5 price, and there were, people wanted to buy 6 million or whatever it was at $5, and there was willing suppliers who wanted to supply that amount, 6 million, at that same $5. That becomes our equilibrium price. Okay, so we have our equilibrium price. Okay, now what happens is nobody is better off, no supplier would be better off trying to charge a different price. So what happens if the supplier decided they wanted to charge more than $5? Well, what's going to happen, remember, we have perfect knowledge. All the buyers know that all the other sellers are selling at $5. So they're not going to buy from this seller who wants to sell at $7. That seller's not going to sell anything. So you raise your price, you lose all your sales. What about lowering your price? Well, remember, at the equilibrium price, you could sell all you wanted to, which was 6, at that price. So if you lower your price, you're not really going to sell more because you could have sold them all at the original $5. So why lower your price? You're just going to throw away money. Okay, what about the flip side? What about the buyers? Well, you can imagine a buyer coming in and saying, I don't want to pay $5, I only want to pay $3. Well, what the store is going to say, or the seller is going to say, well, I know there's plenty of other customers who already know the equilibrium price is 5 and they're willing to buy at 5. So I'm not going to sell to you at 3. So the person wanting the lower price is not going to get it. What about coming into a store and offering to pay more? Well, you could have bought it at $5. Why in the world would you offer 7? Right? There's no advantage to you. You could have bought it at 5. So here you see at that equilibrium price, nobody is better off trying to do anything different than get at that equilibrium price. And you can't make somebody in the system better off without making somebody else worse off. And we'll see that when we look at what happens when the government interferes with a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so we understand what market equilibrium is, and that equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity is the most efficient it can be. Okay, we know what the assumptions are, so we feel pretty good about those. Okay, and again, you want to remember the assumptions because whatever we're talking about, if we change the assumptions in a situation, then we're no longer talking about a perfectly competitive market. Okay, let's go a step further and let's use an example that's somewhat similar to an assignment question that you're going to have. We're going to assume that we have an equilibrium price of $5 and the suppliers are willing to supply 6 and the US or United States consumers are willing to buy 6 at $5. What we're going to do then, so we have a demand curve, and notice I put the US flag next to the D1 curve. Now, we're going to assume that suddenly we're able to sell that same product not only in the US but also in Germany. And Germany has a demand for that same product. There's a certain number they want to buy at that price, at each one of those prices. And so we have the US demand schedule and the German demand schedule. And if we add the two demand schedules together, we get a new D2 demand schedule. And we can add the numbers together pretty easily. Okay, we just add what the U.S. is willing to buy at $9 and what the Germans are willing to buy at $9. And we say we have now at $9 we have a demand for 3. And at $7 we have a total demand of 9. And so forth. So just looking at the little green arrows. Now, what that tells us is because we've added more consumers, we now have shifted or created a new demand curve, D2, that is the sum total of both US and German demand, that is shifted to the right from the original US demand. Okay? And what the suppliers see is when that curve shifted to the right, the suppliers see that as bidding up of the price, so that now the consumers are demanding more at every price, okay, and the suppliers are now willing to demand or to supply more at that new higher price, and we find that that new higher price ends up being $7 in this example, where the suppliers were willing to supply 9, and the new total demand was 9 at $7. So we end up with a brand new equilibrium position in the little green circle marked 2. That's our new equilibrium. We have more supplied and we have it at a higher price. Now, the question becomes, how much is the U.S. willing to buy at that new price? Remember, originally at $5, they were willing to buy 6. And again, we're just looking at the U.S. demand schedule where the green block is. Okay. Now, at $7, they're not willing to buy 6 anymore. Now they're only willing to buy 3, where the yellow triangle is. Okay. So therefore, we have a lot less being demanded by the U.S. because the price has been driven up. And so I drew the yellow box around it. Okay. So we see the existing or previous demand curve, the U.S. still had the same demand curve. The original demand curve is still there. Okay? However, now at this new higher price of $7, the U.S. does not want to buy nearly as much. Okay? So therefore, the total amount demanded by the U.S. is less than it was originally. Okay. Now, this stuff sounds reasonably complicated to you, I imagine. Wouldn't it be nice if you had a roadmap that helped you figure out how to solve these problems? Okay. Well, let me do. So, as I said, it'd be really nice to have a roadmap that would give you an idea what steps to go through to solve a supply and demand problem. Well, in part 9 of the videos on supply and demand, I have how to analyze a supply and demand problem. And there's actually 10 simple questions you have to ask yourself, and they will act as your roadmap. Now, I put together, matter of fact, you'll see an example of this in doc sharing with the hints for this week's assignment. I actually walk you through those steps in an example problem. So it gives you an idea how to go about this. Okay? So if you have any concern about how to do that, go through the video and walk your way through it and look at those, what I put in doc sharing. And if you still have questions, get a hold of me. I'm more than happy to walk you through it. Okay. Now, obviously, if anyone has any questions, you know the drill. Let me know. Now, what do you have to do this week? You only have one chapter this week. It's chapter 3. That's the one on supply and demand. You know about the flashcards. And I've had some people ask me about flashcards and about the grading on those. And basically, the flashcards are, and the presentation part, which is under the reading link, is really there to kind of help you as learning tools. Okay, they're not graded parts. They're not part of the 1,000 points in your grade. What you're graded on is the discussion, you're graded on the assignment, and you're graded on your attendance at the seminar. So those are the 3 things that you're graded on. So the flashcards are there to help you. Now, the videos that I was talking about are in the reading link for this week. Okay? So when you click on the reading icon, it will give you another icon to click on that has all the videos in it. The flashcards may be in the extra. I forget exactly where they are. I'd have to go look. But they're designed to help you. Now, the most important thing in this is if you have any questions, you need to get a hold of me. The quiz that goes with those presentations is optional for you to check your understanding. Again, they are not graded. It's the only things graded are the discussion threads, the assignments, and the seminar participation. Okay, so this week's discussion thread is something that many of you may find interesting. It deals with what are the supply and demand implications of legalizing marijuana, something that we're going through right now in Florida. It's up for vote for medical marijuana. The question really centers on recreational marijuana, and if you do some internet searching, you'll find out that Colorado and I think it's Oregon, anyhow, a couple places have gone to legalize marijuana. And so we want to, now I'm not really interested in what the moral ramifications are, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm only interested in what are the supply and demand implications, or what are the economic implications. You can also look at what are some of the costs associated with keeping, with arresting people who break the law, and how that relates to legalizing marijuana. So you have a lot to play with that. Your assignment question has you, again, this week, remember Unit 3 is a summary unit. In other words, it combines Units 1, 2, and 3. So you're going to find a question on production possibility frontier. You're going to find an example where you've got to do some number crunching, similar to what you did last week in Unit 2. You're going to see some questions you need to answer, and then you're going to have a supply and demand scenario, very similar to what I just explained with the U.S. and German economies, or demand for a product. They're different countries and different product, but you'll get the idea. The solution to the problem will be very similar. Yes, in the discussion thread, you can talk about taxes. You can talk about anything related to economics. So not just supply and demand by itself, but anything related to economics. I just don't want a discussion of the moral yes or no, it's good or bad. Okay. You know how to contact me. And with that, I will see you next week this coming week in the discussions, and next week in the seminars. And with that, thank you all very much for coming. We finished up a couple of minutes early.